Well, hello there. This is your commentator coming at you with yet another pre-show edit. I'm sorry to say, but this episode is a bit shorter than I'd like it to be. The reason is because I made an idiotic mistake when we were recording, and as a result, the last quarter of this interview is missing. It's completely my fault, and as always, I really have to get better at this. Nevertheless, this was a great interview, and I thank my guests tonight for being so flexible with me. And I thank you, dear audience, for continuing to be flexible with me as well as I blunder my way through this. With that being said, let's get into tonight's episode. Well, hello there, and welcome to Elder Scrolls Spotlight, a podcast about roleplay and roleplayers in the Elder Scrolls Online MMO-RPG. Tonight, in an effort to go beyond borders and to speak to folks oriented in the Daggerfall Covenant, I was able to get in contact with one of the DC folks situated in the Covenant Collective. The Covenant Collective is the large OC RP hub for the Daggerfall Covenant. You can join this guild primarily for phasing, meeting other folks, or maintaining RP contacts. Our guest tonight is someone who I'd like to call an organizer, someone who makes RP happen, not as an ego project, but to simply spread RP. She organizes the Tavern Night and the Black Hawk Fight Night. Aside from that, she has also organized Ship RP for official and unofficial purposes. She's also an old-timer who has been role-playing since the chat room era of the internet. I hope to talk to her tonight about her experiences and have a look at the DC community as a whole from her perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have Fyurae joining us. And welcome, well I should say welcome back to the show. How you doing? How you feeling?
I'm doing okay.
All right. I'm glad. Thanks for doing this again. I know it's a little annoying.
Well, thanks for asking me again.
Those of you who aren't sure, we actually did this episode, two months ago, same time around Brynwolf's episode. And like Brynwolf's episode, I wasn't really satisfied with the way the episode turned out. So Fyurae was kind enough to oblige me to try again, and hopefully I'll get it right this time. If not, then we can always do it again. Third, fourth, fifth time, whatever, however long it takes, damn it. Anyway, so let's just take it from the top, shall we? Where are you from? How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm from Western Washington, and I'm 32 years old.
Okay, and how did you get into video games?
When I was really young, I can remember my older brother had an NES, and the neighborhood kids that were closer to my age would come over and watch him play Zelda. And my parents are kind of nerdy, and so even when I was really little, we had a PC in the house, but we didn't have like anything that you would really play video games on. Like, we never had really a gaming PC till I bought one for myself. But I can remember as a kid my dad playing Wolfenstein 3D, and my brother and my dad played Scorched Earth, but I was still too young really to get into it.
What was your first video game?
Well, my first video game was like some learning games on DOS that my parents got me. I had like Mixed Up Mother Goose and some other ones that I don't remember what they're called. But later on, I got into, I think Tomb Raider was one of the first games I had that I really got into. That was really more like a modern video game. I can remember my cousin got a PlayStation and a copy of Tomb Raider for Christmas one year, and we went down and hooked it up to the TV in the basement right away and played it for hours the rest of Christmas Eve night. And then later on, my mom ended up getting it for me for PC, and I played it a ton. And after that, friends had consoles, and I would go over to their houses and play video games.
What was your favorite video game?
That's a tough one to answer. Because I feel like if you're somebody that plays a lot of video games, then it's hard to narrow down even like what genre is really your favorite, or to pick one game from comparing different genres. But maybe I'd say Grand Theft Auto 3 was one of the ones that was like the most enrapturing that I ever played.
Which one was that? I can't remember.
Well, 3, the original Grand Theft Auto 3 was the one with the character that didn't speak. It was more of an avatar character. So there's 3 games that are kind of considered expansions of GTA 3 now, because then they came out with GTA 4 and treated those games like expansions.
Right. And GTA 3 was just called that, GTA 3, right? So how'd you get into MMOs then? Where did that start for you?
MMOs I got into a friend of mine in high school who was actually an RPer, and we became kind of fast friends over that when we both found out that we both liked to RP in chat rooms and stuff. But her dad had bought her a copy of Ultima Online and paid for her subscription for it, because her dad didn't live with her. And that was kind of how they spent time together, was playing UO together. And she got me into that, and that was the first MMO I ever played. But it was also several years kind of after the peak of the game. This would have been in like 2004 or 2005, probably about 2004. So the game was already kind of on, winding down. WoW was about to come out and blow it out of the water.
Then the flip side of that question is how'd you get into RP then?
RP I got into, well, kind of 2 different ways. My parents, back in the 70s and 80s, my dad played D&D before I was born, and my brother played it a little bit as a teenager, but again, it was when I was too young. So my dad had, still has, a bunch of figs and the original edition of AD&D, as well as Redbox edition D&D. And I used to go through the monster manual and deities and demigods book all the time when I was a kid and look at all the different stuff. And I got into fantasy stuff, reading young adult fantasy books. And then when I was in middle school, we finally got a computer that would go on the internet, and I started hanging out in chat rooms. And I'm not exactly sure why, but for some reason the chat rooms I started hanging out in were Wicca and pagan oriented chat rooms, and I don't really know what caused me to be drawn to those when I was 13, but that was where I started hanging out and kind of found a community I got into. And another young kid that was there, because most of the people hanging out in those chat rooms were adults, another person that was close to my age one day was like, "Oh, you should come to this other chat room that I go to all the time. It's an RP room. Come check it out." And I went there with them and started getting into chat room RP.
Okay, so there's a little bit to unpack there, so I'll start with this question. Have you ever played D&D before? Considering...
Kind of. When I was like 12 or maybe younger, some neighborhood kids that were older than me were into it for a short while, and then found out that my dad had a bunch of D&D stuff, and so they tried to get him to run a game for them. And I tried to join them and play, but it was still a little bit over my head. I don't remember how old I was, so I was probably younger than 12. I didn't really get it, and I had a hard time keeping up with them. So it didn't work out particularly well. That's really the only time I've tried to play at tabletop.
Okay. And these Wicca and pagan channels, what were they like? What would they even talk about when it comes to that subject? Was it just like a place where it's like, hey, how you doing? Oh, you're a pagan? I'm a pagan too. What's going on? That sort of thing? Or how'd that work out?
Yeah, it was mostly just a community environment. They didn't talk about paganism or Wicca a lot. It would just happen, you just happen to have that in common, and then you start kind of a community.
Okay. So talk to me about these RP chat rooms. What was your first RP chat room? How'd that go for you?
The first one, I'm not sure if this was the first one I ever went to, but the first one I remember, it was called the Red Dragon Inn, because most RP chat rooms were taverns. And it was just a bunch of people. It was very disorganized. People would pick fights all the time. And it was back in the day that even like this was on MSN was the chat system that we had. We didn't have AOL, but you could open up multiple windows and have multiple instances of the chat room running, and then just change your screen name. So there would be people that would play like multiple characters at the same time, and people would RP with themselves sometimes, or kind of run like come up with antagonists and stuff that way, so that they could direct their own story and kind of have more control over it. But it was just like what Tavern RP is in the game. People show up and you try to find somebody that you can strike up a conversation with and find something interesting about their character and start an RP. And then from there, maybe you'd start meeting up regularly and start having a more in-depth interaction with them. But it was very rarely, there wasn't really plot or nothing was planned. It was just show up and hang out. It was mostly a bunch of teenagers just kind of living in a fantasy world,
So it sounds like it was a generic fantasy world, right?
Yeah, they started out being a lot of the time just fantasy. So you'd have people that were fans of like Lord of the Rings, or people that were fans of like Game of Thrones, or mostly things, back then it was mostly books. There hadn't been kind of this resurgence in fantasy nerd stuff in the mainstream back then. So there was like some young adult fiction that I really liked. Tamara Pierce was my favorite one, so that was a big influence for me. But then you also had like people that would come in RP supernatural stuff, or it was kind of about the time anime started getting a real grip on pop culture, so people that were influenced by anime stuff. I think back then there was things like, I want to say Rurouni Kenshin.
That was my
one
jam.
of those. I don't know.
I'm not
an anime person.
That was my...
Yeah, I can remember a friend that had a character that was like based on that, I think. And then later on, it started to get more specific and more diversified. You'd have places that were set up specifically to be like more like vampire oriented stuff. For example, like they wanted vampire settings.
So niches started to develop, from what I hear from you.
Yeah, I can remember when the X-Men movie came out. That was like a big... X-Men was really big for a while.
Okay, so would you start out as at the Red Dragon Inn? Can you remember?
Just a generic character. I mean, a lot of the time, I think for most of the young people that were into it, it was like such a new thing that you were kind of just writing avatar fiction. You didn't have a well-developed character. You just kind of were... It was self-insertion.
Okay. Sounds like the usual start to how one might begin RP. So where did you go as the niches started to develop, as they started to diversify? Do you remember what came after Red Dragon? And
I remember there were two places that I remember spending a lot of time in, and now with it being so long ago, I can't really tell you how long of a time span a lot of time actually is probably most of my really dedicated RP phase at that age was about 2 years. So after RDI, I remember there was a really cool place that I RP'd for a while, and it was a town instead of an inn. And I don't remember what the name of the town was, but I remember that I made a half-elf character that ended up being the town hostler, and that the person that ran the chat room and had created it was the town healer, and he had a cool character that was blind. And there was this big Celt woman that was the blacksmith, and then there were some other townsfolk, but it was so long ago now, and for kind of a brief period of time, actually. It was probably only a few months that I really spent a lot of time there, but it was really cool, and it was a cool take on doing something a little different at the time.
Do you have any specific memories from this town? Or what was the town called?
I don't remember what the name of it was. The name of the town was the name of the chat room, but I don't remember. I remember my character ended up getting married, but I don't really remember a lot of specific events that happened there.
It was over 1,000 years ago. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I remember I ended up making an alt because I would, if there wasn't anything for my character to do, I ended up making this alt character that was a horse. But it was, the backstory that I made up for it was this young adventurer who was out with his young adventuring party that was inexperienced, and he was a warrior character, and he got killed, and then his mage friend tried to resurrect him and accidentally put him into the body of his horse, and so his friends thought he was still dead, and it just didn't work, but he was actually trapped in the body of this horse. So that was a fun character, and it was kind of silly. That's about as close to silly as I ever get.
I think you can only imagine it'd be a little frustrating for the guy when he sees his friends. I'm alive, I'm right here. And they carry on, presuming he's dead. It's gotta be a little demoralizing, actually. Where did you go after the town RDI? You spoke of X-Men blowing up and becoming a pop culture thing. So were there any chat rooms? I imagine there were some chat rooms around the X-Men.
Yeah, there were a couple that I got into and tried out like some original characters, but I don't really recall that phase lasting very long. But I do remember that for a brief time there was a chat room that had they basically auditioned people to play canon characters, so like canon X-Men characters like Wolverine and Cyclops and stuff. And I got to play, I auditioned for and got to play Beast, which was my favorite X-Men at that time. And now I could hardly tell you anything about him.
I was going to say, you're not alone
Back
there.
then, I was really into it. Back then, he was my favorite X-Men, and I was really into like reading fanfic and stuff.
Okay. So did you have to like brush up on Beast's backstory and like get into some of the comic book plots that concerned him and such?
Yeah, I was pretty well versed on his character arc at that point. I'm not anymore. And also that character, because he's like very highly educated, he's a doctor of some kind. I don't remember what exactly anymore. Physicist maybe,
like some
or something.
Sort of biologist.
Yeah, that's right. He's a biologist. It was cool because my parents were both paramedics for a long time, and so medical knowledge is just kind of common knowledge in my family. So that gave me kind of an edge. I was able to like be the party doctor basically all the time as Beast, and I think that helped me out a lot with getting to play that canon part. So that was, at that age, I felt like that was a pretty big notch in my belt.
Okay. So you don't know anything, or you can't remember anything about the X-Men now.
Well, I remember some things, but I certainly don't remember know as much as I did then.
And there goes my plan to talk X-Men with you. Sadness. Did you see Logan, by the way? What do you think of that movie?
No, I haven't seen it. I hardly ever see movies.
You make me sad. You do. But okay.
I just don't get out much.
But okay. With that being said, what else did you go to after X-Men, after RDI, after The Town?
There was one other. I remember there was one other chat room that I got involved in for a while, and that was probably one of my longest running RPs. And I had this character that was a young man that had really, what would you say, a natural propensity for illusion magic. And keep in mind that at this time, all of the like lore and canon of these chat rooms was just whatever everybody made up, and you kind of had to pretend that it made sense with whatever everybody else was making up. So at any moment, I might have run into a character from some anime that totally didn't make any sense, or a modern gun-wielding vampire. So you just kind of let things roll off your back. But so my character was an illusionist who had like run away to join the circus. So being an illusionist came in handy. And then he later grew up, and I think I started this character actually to play with my friend from high school, who it turned out was an RPer, and she was into like much more edgy, vampy stuff than me. So we made two characters that were going to be brother and sister, and then never actually RP'd together. And I started playing the character, and that character just had, again, it's typical tavern RP basically is most of what goes on until somebody comes in and decides that they want to get some attention and be disruptive and start some kind of conflict. Then you have conflict for a day or two, and then it washes off again.
Okay, talk to me about RP and UO then. I'm not really familiar with Ultima Online, to be honest with you. I know that it was the standard setting MMO back in the day, but what was the universe like for you over there when you first got your start?
I did not RP in Ultima Online. By the time I started playing Ultima Online, it was the 8th anniversary of the game, and it was kind of on the down. It was kind of on the decline. Like I said, like EverQuest and stuff had already come out, and some other MMOs. And by the time I started playing it, it was only a few months before WoW came out. But yeah, I never actually RP'd. I just played MMOs. It wasn't until so from that time, which would have been about 2004, up until a few years ago, I didn't RP. Once I discovered MMOs and started playing them, I just played them.
Okay, so a few years ago, where did you start RPing then?
After I left WoW, got burned out on WoW, I went to Lotro, and Lotro is not nearly as good of an MMO as WoW, although it's a much better in my opinion. I was playing Lotro and started to get bored, and so one day I just happened to go into the Prancing Pony, and for anybody that's not familiar with what Lotro is like as an RP community or an RP environment, every character in the game at that point anyway, I can't speak to the last few years, but at that point, every character in the game, basically you had your starting zones were separate, but from there on, it was a very linear leveling experience, and the characters kind of come together and breathe. So everybody goes through the Prancing Pony. That's so it's a very common location, and it's really the only town, like big town, in the game that at that point a lot of characters had a reason to go to. There's more now because since I stopped playing, they released Gondor and stuff, and there's cities there, obviously, that you can go to. But at that time, Bree was the only city that made any sense for all the different races to go to, even though it didn't make a ton of sense for all of them to go to. But everybody hung out at the pony, and so I just went and wandered through one day and started watching the RPers that I knew were there but had never really participated with, and started lurking, and then would kind of, the way that I've always kind of gotten into RP is to sit around and watch people and see if there's something that I think is interesting, and then think up a character really quick that might be interesting to them or that might work well with theirs, and then rush over and see if it works.
So like an observational approach, and when you see something that might potentially work, then you get into it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, if I don't have established characters, definitely. That's kind of how I get my foot in the door.
Okay. Not to mention, Lotro had a few elements to it that really helped out with RP. Like I always heard about good things about like the music system in that game, which was something to behold.
Yeah, the music system's pretty extensive. At that time, the fact that it had as many emotes as it did was really amazing. It also had a bio feature where you could, on your you could inspect characters, which you can't do in Elder Scrolls. And when you opened up the inspection window, there was a page for them to write a bio of their character. And then it also had a really extensive outfit system that just got even more extensive as the years went on.
Kind of like an ESO where you have all the different motifs. I also think that WoW had a bio system, didn't it? Except it came in the form of like an add-on or something.
It didn't when I played. Yeah, maybe an add-on, but this was built into the game.
I see. How long did you play at Lotro for?
I played it for about a year maybe, and then started RPing, and then I RP'd. I didn't really ever RP as part of the community. I RP'd for about a month and a half, maybe, hanging out in the pony and just meeting random people and not really having it go anywhere, but just hanging out, tavern RP stuff. For about a month and a half, and then met someone that then I started hanging out with more and RPing with more, and then we became kind of, out of character friends more than just RPing, and we met up with other people, and within the next month or so had formed a little kind of out of character friendship group. And it didn't take very long after that before we were just playing other games and stuff. But for several years, I RP'd with that person that I'd met and a few other people in the in the Lord of the Rings universe. Like, our characters were there, but we weren't actually RPing in game anymore. It didn't take very long. And over the years that we were friends, we tried other games and tried other like RP settings back and forth and stuff, but Lord of the Rings was the one that stuck the longest.
So I know you said that you didn't actually say it, but I can assume that your time in RPing in Lotro was a little bit brief, excuse me. But still, could you tell me what the RP community was like there? Because I heard a few things about it.
I wasn't all that involved, so yeah, I didn't RP in the game for very long, although I was tangentially still kind of part of the community, because we would go back and play off and on, and we certainly knew people that were more thoroughly involved. And in fact, a couple of people that I knew from Lotro but didn't know me because I never spent any time in game are now, I've run into them now in Elder Scrolls, people that were pretty prominent in that RP community. But I don't know if I could really give you like a general read on what the community was like. It was people really liked their lore just as much, if not more, than Elder Scrolls. And you had a lot of people that really knew a lot about it.
Yeah, I heard that, but with darker connotations. So, for instance, the idea of shield maidens were something of controversy among the lore buffs. That's one of the things I heard. I heard that there was a lot of Rohirrims, or a lot of Riders of Rohan sort of guilds. One of the major things that my friend told me about was how folks could basically be any race that were situated for any roles, something of like a hobbit warrior or something, and like if fighting for the city of Gondor, he would flame over that, or get so infuriated over that when that happened.
Well, that's not real. Well, it depends. Game mechanics wise, and this kind of goes into RP too. From my perspective, the way that the game approached the story and you as a player, and something that I actually really liked, because it was an MMO where you weren't a chosen one, because clearly you already had some very well established chosen ones, because the story of the game itself follows the Fellowship, but your character is somebody that is kind of always just not quite there at the same time, and it's like you're going through the Lonelands and you're like a month behind them or something, or you show up, after they've left Lothlorien, and so now the elves of Lorien are like kind of rallied or whatever, and so you're constantly following just at their heels, and you're not directly influencing what happens to them, but you're kind of the cleanup crew. And I thought I liked that, because I don't like MMOs where, like, one thing that ESO does that I really don't like is everybody is the vestige, right? So everybody in the whole game has the same.
I've been to Cold Harbor.
Yeah, so I don't really care about that. And WoW was kind of that way too. WoW didn't make you a chosen one. You were just a soldier in the war, kind of. You were a schmuck adventurer who showed up when they needed somebody, and so they put you to work all the time. And I liked that. You were kind of a bystander to the major players in the story. But the other thing about Lotro is, if I can remember what the other thing about Lotro was that I was going to say. Oh, the other thing about Lotro was that the way that they seemed to interpret the story was, I guess, kind of the way that I chose to interpret it, and I guess a lot of people don't, is that to me it always seemed like the Lord of the Rings is kind of told from the perspective of the Hobbit, because at the basest level, theoretically, the books are written by Bilbo and Frodo, right? So it's that unreliable narrator thing that everybody likes to talk about in ESO, right? So when they go out into the world, they have this very innocent perspective on it, and it makes it seem like the machinations of Mordor are something that is like new news to everybody, and people don't know what's going on, whereas the game treated it more like everybody kind of always already knew about this, and the hobbits just don't know what's going on because they're like super sheltered and ignorant of everything going on outside of the Shire. So there were all, and that's where the game of Lord of the Rings Online kind of lives, is in a lot of the unexplored fringes of the lore, and some people really don't like that. Some people really only like it to be like, this is what the book says, and like this is what is outlined, and so that's only the things that you can do.
I can sort of understand that, yeah. That kind of leads towards like a dichotomy of when it comes to people that follow the lore. Like, for people that are of what you said, where they're familiar with of how things should be, I'd call those like strict constructionists, if that makes sense. Like, if it's in the lore, then that's how it should be.
Yeah, exactly. There's no room for you to extrapolate facts.
Yeah. And then then there are those what I call like loose constructionists, where a lot of it is open to interpretation. A lot of it is, just because it's not there doesn't mean you can't do it, and if it works, then hey, that sort of thing. I think both sides of that spectrum have their strong points, but when you tell me that, it just reaffirms my belief that those two, there's that dichotomy pretty much present in every community with a lore behind it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm definitely a loose constructionist type. I like to kind of find places where I can be a little bit more flexible with characters. But at the same time, I mean, you have to know the rules to know how to break them, right?
That's true, and I've never heard it be put like that before. You have to know the rules in order to know how to break them. I like that. That's really good. So, moving on from Lotro there. Actually, no. One last question before we moved on to Lotro. What did you RP as over there? What was your character like?
My main character was a Breland woman who ended up marrying a ranger. And the way that we kind of spun it was, kind of the way that Aragorn is. Well, okay, I'm going to confess to something here. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was pretty young, and I found my mom's copies of the book in my grandma's basement. She has an edition of Lord of the Rings that's it's the first paperback edition, so it's from the 60s, I think, when she was a teenager. And I read those when I was quite young and it was over my head. Like, I didn't really absorb it very well. So most of my familiarity with The Lord of the Rings comes from the movies, and then the game lore follows the book, not the movies. So the things that are different they follow the book. They're pretty good about adhering to the books. They just happen to extrapolate some things that people don't like. So the way that Aragorn is presented and how the Rangers are presented is that they're seen by the townspeople of Bree and other people in that area as being bad guys, kind of, because bad things always happen when they're around. Like, they're not to be trusted, and that's something that the Rangers just allow the townspeople to kind of live in ignorance of. That yes, they do always show up and bad things happen when they show up, but that's because they're there to prevent things from getting worse. So they kind of have the troublemaking vigilante bent to them. And so she's a young woman of Bree that her parents die, because let's be honest, most RP characters' parents die. And she ends up taking up with this ranger, and they get married and start a family together. So her personal character development was mostly about her becoming a much more capable person, as from an adventuring and rangering point of view, learning to keep up with his lifestyle and learning to be able to be someone that could support him in combat and keep up with him so that they could spend time together without him having to just give up what he felt was, a family tradition duty.
Okay, so now we can move from Lord of the Rings. Although you played the game off and on again, what else did you play before coming to ESO?
I hopped around a lot. Okay, that was me dropping the mouse. I hopped around a lot from different games with the friends that I made in Lotro. We tried Guild Wars, which I hated at first, Guild Wars 2 when it came out, which I really hated because I'm not an anime person and I feel like it has a very definite anime aesthetic. They got into that for a while and I did not. We tried Rift for a few days. We tried What else did we try? We went back and played like a bunch of old MMOs. And then we also played a lot of not RP, not fantasy MMO games like DayZ, and we played, what else? I can't remember now. It's been a few years since I kind of parted ways with that group of friends. So we just bounced around, and then we came to ESO when the betas were going on, and started playing at that time.
Okay, so getting to ESO beta, what did you make of it? Was it crappy as the people complain, or was it really not that bad?
No, it was terrible. It was terrible. I still, I don't want to offend anybody who really loves ESO, but to this day, ESO to me is not a very good MMO. There are some things that they do that are really cool. They tried to be very out of the box, and that's admirable, I guess. But for one, I'm somebody that's pretty content with the status quo, so I was perfectly happy with the old days of having 5,000 hotkeys and standing in one spot and pressing the number 1 until things died. That's all I really needed out of an MMO, because I don't play MMOs for the gameplay, really. I play MMOs to run around and look at cool level design and do quests and zone out and enjoy myself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But let's get into that. What are some things about ESO that you don't like?
Things that I don't like? Probably as someone that at that time, RP was still a really big part of how I spent my time. One of the things that was the hardest for me was that I feel like the character modeling is terrible. So that was really frustrating. It's really hard as an RPer to try to get into a game when you can't make a character that you think looks cool, or at least, inspires some creativity. It's especially hard if you already have characters in mind, like I usually do, because I tend to pack characters with me from one milieu to another. Some of the other things I didn't like. Back then, when you went to make a character, you had to play through the starting zone, and you had to play through the secondary starting zone. So you couldn't actually interact with other people until you were level 15. Except you had to play, for example, being a DC player, you had to play through Stros, you had to play through Betnik. You couldn't go and join the actual population of the game until you got to Daggerfall at level whenever it was. Oh, and you had to play through Cold Harbor to start with too, which was really long at that time.
The tutorial.
Yeah, you had to play the tutorial. So you're stuck in those starting zones for a really long time. And here was the real deal breaker, honestly, when we came to play the game during beta. On Betnik, there was a quest that was broken and you couldn't complete it. And that was true through 3 or 4 betas, however many there were. There were multiple. And it was still true on launch. They had never fixed it. So there was a good chance that if you rolled a DC character, you couldn't even finish the starting zone. You would get stuck. And there was no way to work around it. I do remember that eventually we got past it, so either they finally fixed it, or I think that it was a 50-50 chance, so you could delete your character and re-roll it, but as far as putting a ticket in or trying to get it to work, we couldn't ever figure out how to make it work.
I see. Wow. I mean, so from that beta to, I think Dragon Ball was released 2 weeks ago as of today, right? Can we say that it's made some significant strides forward, or do you think, nah, this is stuff that should have already fixed by now?
Yeah, I think as far as technical game-breaking stuff like that, it really should have been fixed. And I want to say, I might be wrong, but I want to say that even after launch, they didn't have all of the voice work in the game, so some of the factions were voiced, and then some of them had robot voices. But I might be wrong, and that might have been just during one of the betas.
Okay. Backtracking a bit, how did you first come across ESO?
My friend, well, I had played Skyrim. Skyrim's the only Elder Scrolls game I've played aside from ESO. And my Lotro friends were a little better versed in Elder Scrolls than I was, most of them. And so when it was announced, I had one friend that was really looking forward to it, really wanted, thought it was going to be like the new game that we would all be able to get into and RP and, you know, have a real MMO home again that we all actually liked, because I didn't like Guild Wars. And be able to spend time together. So he was the one that like signed up for the ESO-RP forum really early on. He was a very early on member and finally kind of talked me into it, because I'm always socially kind of a bag dragger and don't want to go out and meet new people. But so he dragged us into that. He was always dragging us into lots of things.
Okay. And walking into the game after playing, or walking into the game having played Skyrim, or your expectations for it as far as an Elder Scrolls game went?
Well, I think it was the same. That I think everybody felt kind of the same. That everybody was kind of hoping that this was going to be like Skyrim Online, you know, like that it would be Skyrim that you'd be able to play with a bunch of people and you'd be able to go outside of Skyrim. That was basically my hope for it. My expectations were maybe a little bit lower because I knew that that wasn't really going to be the case. But I actually, in the early days, aside from how much I hated the character modeling, as far as the gameplay went, it felt pretty good. I had a good time with it. It was a little bit hard for me. I struggled for a long time to get used to the more active defense mechanisms. So like instead of in old MMOs, you just had a stat that was like defense, or you had a block stat or a dodge stat, and it was just a number crunching thing. You didn't have to actively dodge. That was something that really frustrated me with Guild Wars. I had a really hard time getting used to Guild Wars because that was the first game that I ran into that was like that. And it shook me all the way down to having to kind of relearn to play MMOs, because prior to that, I'd never been somebody that used WASD to move in games, because I never played like first-person shooters and stuff. So that was really weird for me to get used to use the keyboard instead of the mouse to move. So it was like I had to relearn everything.
Okay. So then when it comes to the character modeler, has that improved for you some, or has that more or less stayed the same?
Well, no, I don't think it's improved because it hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed at all? Okay.
Not that I know of. I mean, the only thing that changed was that I went from wanting to make Breton and Nord characters to wanting to make Redguard characters, and Redguards actually look pretty good. But as far as I can tell, if you try to make a Breton or a Nord, they still look terrible.
I think they look pretty good, but okay, I can sort of see what you're saying.
Nord women are really bad. The Nord males aren't so bad. Your character's a male. Yeah, Nord women are pretty rough. Because it's not that it's not that it's an ugly character, you know, in the way that you think of someone as being ugly. It's the fact that they look so weird. Like, they're just, their face, their bone structure isn't quite right. They have like this alien quality to them. Nord women especially, like, they don't have any eyebrows. It's like really bizarre. And then like Breton females are okay, but their heads are like really tiny. They have like these really doe-eyed head shape. It's really hard to make any characters that have like some character and like gravity to them. And like Breton males, their heads are like really round and their eyes are really close together. And all the characters in the game have really weird body proportions, which you have to kind of learn how to work around that and trick the game into making something that looks okay.
Mm-hmm. See, I chalk that up to the game engine. The hero engine is something that I've never been a fan of, especially since the they used it in Star Wars: The Old Republic, and back then it wasn't even complete. They had to come up with a few patch fixes of their own with that. But when it comes to ESO, it looks like they used a completed version of it. But even then, it's not that even optimal.
I suppose you could blame it on the engine, but to me, you can't really blame it on the technology, because look at every game that came before it that uses an even less sophisticated character creation engine, but people can make characters that they're satisfied with. So many ESO characters have this weird uncanny valley effect because the designers don't know like how to design the character well. Like, they get proportions wrong. Like, characters' body proportions are so weird. And to me, that's the design team, because it shows in how they model like dogs and horses too. Like, they don't know how to make things look right. You know, things kind of come across as like a kindergartner trying to draw something. Like, you're getting the impression, but they're not looking at it in an artistic way.
Okay. Well, this leads us to our next question. How did you come up with the character that you have in ESO? Or in this case, how did you come up with the characters that you have in ESO?
My characters came from an original RP setting that I started with one of my Lotro friends pretty early on when we became friends in this group. I had my Lotro main character that I RP'd with one of them, and then with another friend I had another character that was an alt that we RP'd together, and then as a group we kind of had a couple of RPs that we tried to do. But this other girl that was part of the group and I didn't have characters that just the two of us RP'd. So of course, since there was like four of us that were all friends, it was like, well, depending on who's on when, we would do different things. And so we decided to like, oh, let's just do something that we totally make up together, because she and I in that group were the ones that had a history of RP, actually. The other two in the group had only started RPing in Lotro. And she was a forum RPer and I was a chat room RPer, so we were kind of used to, you know, places where you would make up your own kind of your own milieu, your own world, and do a lot of world building, and we enjoyed it. And we both were kind of like writers, as we're hobbyist writers. So we decided to do that. And so we came up with a world that, in hindsight, I realize now that she basically wanted to play Daenerys. Fuck, I let go of the button again. In hindsight, I realized that she basically wanted to play Daenerys Targaryen, which is something that we later joked and teased her about a lot, because a lot of the characters she made were basically Daenerys. But at that time, I didn't know anything about Game of Thrones, and so I didn't catch on to it. So she was like, oh, I want to have a character that that's, you know, like a young girl and like gets married off or like forced to go live with another culture that's very foreign to her, and have it be like a very fish out of water experience or whatever. And I don't think that it ended up being quite exactly what she had in mind, because she didn't get to be kind of the damsel that got stuck with like a brutish guy that she, you know, reformed, which is kind of the gist of what I take away from Daenerys and Drogo. But it kind of took on a life of its own, and especially I can get really into world building, and so I kind of ran with it, and that's where the characters came from. Is we came up with a world that was kind of, I can't really say exactly how we came up with the world that we set it in, but somehow we ended up with, maybe it was the Drogo thing, but we ended up with a world that had a lot of different cultures in it. So her character was from a culture that was basically like kind of a Roman Empire or Greek feel to it, or maybe like even Egyptian ancient civilization feel to it, kind of a mix. and my characters were kind of Middle Eastern, and then later I started incorporating like a lot of Indo-Persian mythology and influences on them, and it ended up being much more of a world building exercise than the RP really going anywhere, although we did RP off and on for several years. But I think because we had that world that we built that incorporated so many cultures, and that's kind of it's shaped kind of in the similar way that ESO's is, where you have a lot of different races and they take a lot of inspiration from real world cultures and kind of mix and match them here and there. And that's kind of how our world was. So those characters moved over to ESO really well when I came over and started playing, and just, you know, wanted to pick a character off the top of my head. And usually if I start playing an RPG or an MMO or something like that, even if I'm not planning on RPing, I'll pick a character that kind of has some history to it.
So walk me through what it's like to world build. What usually goes into thinking about that? Where do you find the starting point? How do you go about doing it?
I don't know if I would do it the same way now, because my personality has changed a bit in the last few years. But back then, because it was just we were just doing it totally for fun, and it was just going to be like, oh, you know, Two Girls is probably going to be like a bunch of romantic crap, and we're just going to do whatever we feel like and not take it too seriously. We just went with it. And so, and I kind of, in RP, I do kind of start out that way. I'll just get like a rough estimation of a character, and then typically the way I go about it is I just start RPing and start I tend to just make up stuff on the fly as I go, because in conversation with somebody, you know, the natural flow of conversation is two characters are getting to know each other, or when you're getting to know somebody in real life, you know, you talk about something and then they mention something, and so you'll ask a question and get more details about it, and I would just make it up as I went. And then later on I'd have to go back and be like, okay, here's a thing I made up. Now I need to, you know, figure that out and see how that actually makes sense. So, like, for example, when we would RP, like, in passing, my character might have mentioned that, or it would be figured out or mentioned somehow that, like, okay, my character's father is dead. Well, how did your father die? Well, this is how he died. Okay, what did he do? And, like, all of these things, and I would just make it up as we went. And then later have to go back and kind of reconcile things that I had just made up. And for me, a lot of the time, it comes out in character dialogue. My character will say something, like tell an anecdotal story or something about their childhood or their history, or mention something that they did in the past, just because.
So in that way, it's something that your character decides, and from there you start providing the building blocks. Do I have it down?
Yeah, kind of. I think of it as like throwing something in because it just sounds good. I just like throw it in for flavor, and then later on I'll go back and kind of make it something more substantial.
Mm. Okay, so what is this world called? Did you ever give it a name?
Well, we never titled the like story, but we did end up giving the world the name of Adra. We went with Adra because it seemed like there was thematically a thing of like fantasy worlds having 4-letter names, and like in Lord of the Rings, it's Arda is the name of the world, and of course Nirn.
So what did you import from that world to ESO? The characters and mannerisms, does that also include some things of the lore of that world into ESO, or was it mostly just the characters themselves? Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, the characters definitely. My characters have stayed pretty true because I've I've already been kind of living and working with them for 5 years. My main character especially, but as far as the lore, it was kind of a practice of reconciling it. So it took me. It was kind of strange because I came in and started playing ESO again last year when Morrowind was announced, so about a year ago. And I was just playing. I wasn't RPing. One of my friends from that group was just like, they're going to drop this. Do you feel like going back and playing? Because I already owned the game and we'd never played it. So we started playing for a while, and I played it for a month or two and leveled up. I think I got almost to the cap before I started RPing. And like I said, when I came back and started playing the game, I had just grabbed that character because I was going to play a Dragon Knight, and that was my past RP character that fit that the best. And it was also kind of like not my most active RP character at that time, but was the one that was still kind of on my brain because I was still doing a lot of writing for that world and stuff. So there wasn't a lot of I don't okay. There wasn't a lot of lore necessarily to bring over. It was more like having to sit down and figure out what the ESO equivalent of it was.
How to reconcile the two concepts.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, let's get into it. Let's start with your main character. Who is he? Where does he hail from? What's he like?
Well, my main character right now is Aram. He's a Redguard. He has kind of I kind of am reluctant to say it, but he has a mysterious past, just in that he's currently kind of involved with the criminal element in the Daggerfall Covenant, and so naturally part of that is that you probably don't reveal a lot of personal details to every person you meet, so it doesn't come up a lot. So people that have RP'd with me very much on that character probably know by now that he was a Covenant soldier. He's no longer a Covenant soldier, clearly. At this point in time, he is living in Wayrest. He took up with a woman who was running a bar in Wayrest under that's running the bar, but she's not the bar owner. She works under a gang there that is backed by a noble family that remains anonymous and obviously doesn't officially have any hand in any criminal activity because that would be illegal. But he took up basically with her and kind of got invested in trying to make life easier for her, basically, and that was how he got his foot in the door there, and just has been adrift and kind of avoiding responsibilities and avoiding his life.
Why does he avoid responsibility / avoid his life? Especially since he's a criminal. I imagine as a criminal you'd have a lot of responsibilities to make sure that things don't go south, right?
Well, he's become a criminal to avoid the responsibilities of his real life, which are his own more personal demons, which I guess I don't really want to go into too much because there's not a lot that's been revealed so far, and I don't want to maybe spoil it for people that might get to find out the fun way.
Okay, so who else do you RP besides Aram? Excuse me.
The other character that I get a lot of RP on is Adil, who is now he is a ship captain, technically speaking. He won the title or deed, or I don't know exactly what you would call it, but he won ownership of a ship from a Weasley Little Breton captain that bet all of his season's earnings on a dice game and lost, and then challenged Adil after he lost and was in a huff and tried to take back his winnings by force, and when that didn't work, he basically got himself out of it by giving over the ownership of his ship, but of course not before he went back and had his crew completely ransack it. So Adil he went from being a gambler and kind of a libertine and a lazy drunk to becoming captain of a ship and thinking that it was going to be kind of a get rich quick scheme.
Sounds like a real Star Wars-esque sort of character. Like when you mention him, I think of either like Han Solo or Han Solo. Excuse me. I think of Han Solo or like Lando. You know, the way they get a ship, and then especially through the card game sort of thing, because that's how Han won the Millennium Falcon from Lando. He won in card game essentially, which has been a sore spot for Lando ever since. Sorry, bit of Star Wars lore there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess maybe kind of like Han or Lando, but they have more. They're certainly, I think, more ambitious than Adil. Like Adil basically just wants to do whatever he feels like and not have to work too hard, and so it's not like he's really necessarily looking to get rich, because he's actually from a landed family. So if he wanted to, he could turn his attention and effort into making that a source of fame and income and notoriety. Notoriety is a good word. But he's much more about just, not having to take on the responsibility and just leading an easy life and drifting from place to place and doing whatever he feels like whenever he feels like doing it. And so to him, it seemed like he says that it's serendipity that, that the ship basically just landed in his lap. And at first he felt like it was going to be easy. He owns the ship, but he was just going to hire crew, hire captain, and send it off and let them do the work, and he'd collect the money. But it didn't work out that way, and so he's kind of stuck trying to reconcile the fact that it turned out to be more work than he wanted. And also, I think that now he's kind of finding that as he's gotten older in life, he didn't expect to ever be in a place where he would kind of feel like it was time for him to take on responsibility. And I think that he is surprised to find himself feeling so loyal and so responsible for the people that depend on him for their livelihood, like the people that work the ship and people that
He sounds like he was looking for a sense of purpose, something that was more towards his personality as opposed to what his family had. And from there, he sort of started to grow, if I had to call it anyway.
Well, I don't think he was looking for a sense of purpose. I think he was pretty happy not having a purpose. And that was really kind of the life that he wanted. And he didn't expect that this was going to become a purpose, but it's kind of like he inadvertently took on the responsibility that, even though he never wanted responsibility, he's too honorable, probably unfortunately too honorable, to just let it go and not hold up expectations.
Okay. And who else do you have after that?
My other character is Naeem, who is Adil's older brother. And so he's actually the family heir. And I haven't RP'd him a great deal. And I think that it might be because, honestly, Adil, of the three, Adil was the least developed character that I brought to ESO. So I think that actually made it easier to RP him because I was more flexible in how I changed his position and I didn't really change his personality, but I was more flexible with how I changed his backstory, and so he was easier to fit into the lore, and he's a little bit easier to also the fact that I made him a ship captain and somebody that frequents taverns makes it a lot easier to have him just kind of jump into the community. But Naeem is Adil's older brother, and he's certainly he's basically the opposite of Adil. He's very dutiful. He was a Covenant soldier for a long time, a career soldier, career cavalryman. He's there. I consider them a Redguard family, but Naeem is supposed to be half Colovian through a kind of diplomatic marriage. Their family is from the northeastern or very far eastern part of Hammerfell. They're very close to the Colovian Highlands, and so they're kind of mixed descent. And their land is out there in the east, and I've treated it as it's a very disenfranchised area because it's not, at least for me, because my history is just in Skyrim and ESO itself. That part of the world isn't very well detailed in my head. So, and it's also on a map, it's pretty far from most of the hubs of civilization. It's on the fringes of Cyrodiil, it's on the fringes of Hammerfell, and there's a lot of open country out there, and that's kind of where their land is. They're very disenfranchised, rustic lifestyle.
So if they're disenfranchised, does their family have a focus, how some noble families, they breed horses, how other noble families, they're more focused just on the arms industry, that sort of thing?
Yeah, their contribution in the past, as it were, when they had one to really give, was that they're horsemen and they bred horses. But now the land itself is actually abandoned, and the history of that is that there was an outbreak of disease that took out enough of the town there that it made the rest of the town folk have to leave, either from simply fear of contracting the disease during the outbreak, or just because there weren't enough people left behind to really keep the town functioning. So it's been abandoned for several years, probably close to a decade. Probably longer than that, actually, about 15 years. And then the other thing that, well, I guess, I don't know if you could really call it a resource, but just the fact that where they're situated, they're kind of removed from Redguard proper society, and they're in kind of that space of limbo between the different provinces, that they're kind of it's like a frontier town, right, where they're kind of left on their own, so they have to be very self-sufficient, but at the same time they don't have authority looking over their shoulder quite as much. So it was kind of a mixed populace town where they could take in people that didn't have other places to go, and that was what their little community was built on.
Okay. What are the Adil and Naeem? They're brothers, right?
Yeah, they're half brothers.
Half brothers. So what are their relationships like in regards to each other? Do they hate each other because they're opposites, or what's that dynamic like?
Well, they certainly don't hate each other, but they have I guess they have almost kind of a father-son type of relationship, because Naeem is so responsible and dutiful, and Adil is so not. So Adil is, like the screw-off younger brother that was always getting in trouble, and Naeem was always getting him out of trouble. And actually, I keep letting go of the button. And when they were young, actually, Naeem being the older brother and would have been heir to their family land, was in line to take over those duties, and Adil would have gone off to war and become a Covenant soldier. But when Adil was young, he lost his right arm. He only has one arm. And so obviously he couldn't become a soldier. It was not a very effective one anyway.
Not like he was devastated.
Yeah, and it's not like he was devastated. He didn't want to be. But out of a sense of duty, that kind of left Naeem to kind of take on both duties in their family. And this is one of the things in their backstory that's kind of a little weird, I guess, for Elder Scrolls, because they come from this other setting originally. So this is kind of an integral part of their relationship, so I didn't change it. But in Elder Scrolls, I suppose you could say that there's no real reason that Naeem had to go on and become a soldier, or he already was, but there was no reason that he necessarily had any responsibility of Adil's that he had to take on because of what happened to Adil. But that's kind of the implication, and something that I have yet to quite reconcile with the lore.
This is just a random question that popped into my head, but how Redguardy or how traditionalist is Naeem on a scale of 1 to 10, if you had to give me a number?
Well, I'll give you probably like a 9 with a caveat. And that is that, again, it has to do with them coming from a different setting. His character is supposed to be very traditional, except that a lot of the values that I feel are very deeply instilled in the character aren't necessarily Redguard ones, because they don't quite line up. But it works because so they're forebear Redguards, and their family history is that their lineage their patrilineal heritage, I think that's the right word, traces back to the Regatta. So they were kind of the explorers and conquerors of the Redguards, and as they moved east, they kind of civilized from their perspective. I'm sure that all the elves that they killed didn't feel that way, but they civilized the Hammerfell and pushed further and further east. And the way that I explain it is that basically they finally came to a place in the east where their ancestor felt like they were ready, to settle down, or maybe when they reached a certain age or something, or were no longer able to be part of the warrior caste, they settled there, and that's what became their homeland. And that's far, like I said, far in the east of Hammerfell. So they were, their lineage traces back into the forebear history pretty far, as the forebears came east. So, but, which is kind of strange to say that Naeem is very traditional, because honestly, the forebears are kind of the more liberal faction of Redguard. Like, they're much more open-minded, even though they're the warrior caste. They're kind of forced to be more open-minded because they were much more of, they weren't rich, and they were much more living off the land, and you had to kind of accept things as they were. And, an able body is kind of a commodity, so you can't turn away possible allies. They're a little bit more accepting of outsiders and stuff than the crowns are, which I apologize if I'm interpreting any of this lore improperly, because it's entirely possible. But so to say that he's traditional, I think of him as a very archetypical traditional father figure, like that's kind of his archetype. But he's archetypically traditional in some fairly liberal values, especially where kind of Redguards are concerned.
Okay. And then Aram and Adil, they're kind of further away from that spectrum, obviously.
Yeah, Adil was much more about kind of like living the life. If he had been a city noble, he would have been very happy. But if he wanted to embrace being a noble of the family, it meant being in their family. It means more being a steward of their land than their land is out on the fringes of Hammerfell. So it means more about being a steward of their land and their people. It means a lot more work than it does living the high life, which is more what Adil is about. So he kind of shirked those responsibilities and was more about socializing, being a socialite, and then later on, when his family's influence waned, more about just being kind of a libertine living in the city. So Adil spent, obviously he grew up as a young person on their family land, but then after his injury and after it turned out that he wasn't going to become a soldier, he has spent most of his time in Sentinel and around the Iliac Bay in the city, in different cities, Sentinel and Wayrest, and maybe even Daggerfall a little.
So when it comes to Adil, how central is the loss of one arm to the character? I'm curious about that.
It's very important and it's not very important. It's very important because it is a huge part of the dynamic between him and his brother, and it shaped his life a lot. But in his day-to-day routine, it's not entirely significant.
It's not like if he drops something, it's not like he's going to have great difficulty with it.
Yeah, it's not, the lifestyle that he leads is he gets by just fine without it. You can play cards and touch horrors without a hand. You only need one.
So among these three, do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite?
Well, no, not really, I guess. Aram is my main character. And his personality is kind of a blend of the two, of Adil and Naeem. So in the previous context, in the original setting RP that I did, Aram was the character that I was playing, and Adil and Naeem developed out of his backstory, basically. So, and out of the world building. So, So Aram is my favorite just because he's my main, basically. But I feel like, to be perfectly honest, my favorite thing about all three of the characters is the way that they complement and contrast each other. There's a lot of ways that they're similar and a lot of ways that they're different, and the dynamic between them and kind of how they influence each other and how they contradict each other is the part that I find really fascinating about them. So they really kind of belong together. They're kind of a whole. They're different parts of a whole.
Okay. So getting into the influences of their creation, obviously, since you took them from your own homebrew universe, let's call it that. were there any other influences in their creation? What you mentioned the Indo-Persian sort of deal before. Uh, what about that did you take and put into your characters, if there is anything there?
Well, I think I went with the Indo-Persian thing kind of came from actually other influences. One being that I work with horses in real life, and one thing that I kind of fall back on in RP is horsemanship knowledge and sometimes medical knowledge. Like, I usually will play a character that's relatively well versed in one or the other, or even both, so that it kind of gives me like a well of knowledge to draw on for flavor and to like make a character that has some depth, and it's like a skill that I can illustrate for them very easily because
Sure,
it's
use what
stuff
you
that
know.
I know about. Yeah, exactly. You write what you know. So because of that, I chose, when I was starting this RP, and also well, no, I can't really say Drogo thing because, again, at that time I didn't know anything about Game of Thrones. But so I chose for my original influence for the characters to be kind of Bedouin, and then started just branching out, kind of, to make things a little bit less cut and dry, and also just because they were cultures that I didn't know a great deal about. So when I started researching them, there were a lot of things that, the novelty of it and finding out new things about them was really interesting. So that was just kind of where it started, was just picking a kind of horsey culture to go with that fit well with what my friend wanted to do, because I kind of just told her, we'll do whatever you want to do and I can just make it up as I go. So that was what worked and what I picked. So I can't really say that there wasn't anything that I really pulled out of the Indo-Persian stuff early on. That came later on with more world building as I branched out from kind of the seed that was started and started adding other cultures to the world.
Okay. Then I suppose an offshoot of that question would be, are there any real life influences that you borrowed from North words? How do I explain it? Did you borrow any real life aspects from? Jesus. Basically, I'm saying, like, were there any people that you might have modeled your character off of? Like, I know some people might have modeled some of their characters off like real life historical people or things from like TV shows. Did you have anything of that in your Redguard trio at all, or was it a wholly original?
Well, my first character, Aaron, was, to be perfectly honest, just because, again, it was just kind of, we were doing whatever, fly by the seat of our pants, was just whatever I felt like doing. So in a way, I guess Aram is almost a self-insert, except that I'm not trying to do, what I would do, but it's just whatever I felt like doing with the character. So that character is just kind of made up. So I guess my own personality is the biggest influence on that. Until later, when I had the other characters to kind of think about how they influence the character. But so Aaron being kind of based on my own personality, when I started developing like his role models and characters that would have influenced him in the past, I went to honestly kind of some overbearing father figures that I've had in my life. One of them is my boss, who is, I work at a horse farm, and he's a very, like, not really cowboy type personality, but a very very salt of the earth personality. He's a very stern person and kind of a hard person to be around. He's not warm and friendly. Not that he means to be that way. And that was a big influence for Naeem. My grandpa was also a big influence for Naeem because my grandpa was also that kind of personality. My grandpa was very gregarious, but he had a lot of personal demons and could be, as a kid, he was hard to be around. He was a very intimidating person. And that was my influence for Naeem, was to take those very intimidating, very stern personalities and kind of create a character out of that. And then Adil just became the opposite of that. Just because I liked the dynamic of the two brothers that were so different from one another, despite having more or less the same upbringing, and because they grew up slightly differently, but mostly it's because Adil kind of rejected their upbringing, whereas Naeem more dutifully embraced it. And then Aram is sort of caught between the two. Like, he doesn't quite know which way to go. So he's kind of a mix of both of them.
Okay. Looking at Naeem then, in relation to Adil, is there some sort of desire there to have that freedom that Adil has, or is he? Because when you say duty, I think of more like, he's doing it out of obligation, as opposed to, if he didn't have to, he wouldn't do it. Does that make sense?
I don't think freedom's quite the right word. For the two of them, it's more like, or for Naeem, it's more like the way he was raised, like he embraced the values that he was raised with, of being responsible for people that depend on you, as a noble, like having a very definite sense of responsibility for the people that depend on the land that you own and that make their livelihood there, and doing right by them, and very traditional family values. It's a sense of duty, but more it's a sense of fulfillment, I guess. Like, he's embraced that is how you become fulfilled with your life. Like, you try to do right by people, and you try to have influence with people. And a wisdom that he lives by, basically, is that the only way that you live on after you die is by the way that you have touched other people's lives. So that's what's most important if you want to leave a legacy.
That's an interesting philosophy, to not necessarily live on through your deeds, but through other people and their memory of you. I suppose that's sort of like how people want to be remembered as, that sort. Going over towards Adil and Naeem, focusing on the brothers' relationships just a bit more. Do they maintain regular contact with each other, or is it more of, they know each other's alive and that's good enough for them?
No, they're well, I don't want to say close, but I guess they're kind of that. They're close, I guess. They don't see each other a whole lot, but they do maintain contact, and they do, they have a good relationship. They don't hate each other, and they don't not get along, although they do, basically bicker at each other, and as siblings will do, right? They kind of have embraced the fact that they're very different, and they're okay with that. And they see each other regularly. In the past, it was Naeem kind of supporting his brother, who's, he only has one arm and he can't maintain his livelihood, and so you take care of your brother. But even though Adil, was probably spending all of that money on blackjack and hookers, but and now that kind of their fortunes have shifted a little bit and their roles are a little bit reversed because of some of the misfortunes that have fallen on Naeem, and Adil is kind of lucked into this position where he's able to make money and make a good livelihood and a profit, especially considering that, you know, he doesn't maintain a home or a family. He has plenty of money to spare when things are going well. So now he's kind of, I guess, probably enjoying a little bit of the fact that he can try to kind of look after his brother a little bit financially and, you know, pay back a little bit of what he feels he owes.
Pay back what he owes. That's a sound way of thinking when you look at it. Speaking of which, we've arrived at the end of this episode. I regret my blunder that we've come here so abruptly, but thank you for coming onto the show again, Fyurae. And thank you, dear listener, for being with us tonight. As always, I'll see you in the next episode.